Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the stark divide between facts on the ground and a government built on fiction, as Trump and Noam shamelessly lie about yesterday's execution of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE officer, as more video evidence and testimony by bystanders makes clear that an American citizen, a mother of three who are now orphans, was killed in cold blood by a government goon for no reason. Joining us is David Schultz, a professor of political science at Hamline University and University of Minnesota School of Law. He's the author of 30 books and various articles on American politics, ethics, election law, and media. Most recently, American Politics in the Age of Ignorance, Why Lawmakers Choose Belief Over Research, and his latest book is Generational Politics in the United States, From the Silence to Gen Z and Beyond. And then we'll look into whether the Venezuelan leadership still in power sacrificed Maduro and his Cuban protectors in a secret deal with Trump and Rubio. Joining us is Alejandro Velasco, Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and a professor at New York University, an historian of modern Latin America focusing on social movements, urban culture, and democratization. He's the author of Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. And he has an article at The Guardian, Maduro is gone, but his regime is intact. What happened behind the scenes? Then finally we'll speak with Ryan Cooper, senior editor at The American Prospect. He's the co-host of the Left Anchor podcast, as well as the author of How Are You Going to Pay for That? Smart Answers to the Dumbest Questions in Politics. And his latest articles at the American Prospect are Trump's Cargo Cult Imperialism in Venezuela and Donald Trump's degenerate plans for Greenland, which we'll discuss with Ryan, who spent time in Greenland last summer and joins us to try to make sense of Trump's belligerent bluster. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is David Schultz, a professor of political science at Hamline University and the University of Minnesota School of Law. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Schultz.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And a horrible shooting took place yesterday in your city of Minneapolis. ICE was nearby at the Roosevelt High, spraying kids with chemicals and roughing up teachers and behaving in a disgusting manner. But nearby, they executed really, Renee Nicole Good. She was killed by an ICE officer. The video evidence is overwhelming. This is a woman she's a mother of three. Those kids are now orphans. The youngest is 6 years old. Her partner was in the car with her, I believe, when it happened. But we are in a country where there's this incredible divide between facts on the ground and a government built on fiction and reality TV, and Trump and Noam are just shamelessly lying, and yet the evidence is staring us in the face. So how are the American people finally going to adjudicate what happened, and will the truth and reality emerge?
Well, we want to hope that the truth and reality is going to emerge. But what's happened also today on Thursday is that the FBI has said they're not going to cooperate now with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in Minnesota. And the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension does investigations of situations like this into crimes. And originally, the FBI said, "Okay, we're going to gather more facts. We're going to work with the state agency to really try to, figure out what actually happened here." And instead, basically, this on Thursday morning, they said, "Nope, we're not going to cooperate." And Nome gave a statement that said, "Nope, the agent acted fully in accordance with our procedure, did everything we said, was fully justified in doing what they're going to do." So not only is the government, the federal government, not willing to cooperate in an investigation to really get the facts in the matter, but they've already made up a decision. I mean, essentially, Nome has said at this point he didn't do anything wrong whatsoever. So I am skeptical that we're going to get the U.S. government to ever do a clean investigation or admit anything that is in terms of what the truth is going on here. And they're not interested in getting to the truth. But this is why we had on Wednesday night, and it's hard to even estimate how many thousands of people showed up on the streets, how many showed up for a memorial for the victim, and how many probably more are going to be showing up in the next few days. And that's how the public is going to have to get truth to the matter here. That the electoral process is only one part of it, but they're going to have to come out into the streets peacefully, of course, but come out on the streets and let it be known that this type of behavior is not supposed to be acceptable in what we hope is supposed to be an American democracy.
Well, Trump has created this monster, and
Yes.
so has Stephen Miller, and they've done it deliberately, and it serves their interests, and they recruit these mindless pro-MAGA thugs. So he's got his own police force, and you know how crazy Miller is, what a racist and a hater he is. And the stuff that he sprouts is just insane. And same with Trump. They blame everything on radical left lunatics, and they've smeared this victim, this 37-year-old mother of three whose kids are now orphans. And this is what they do. And frankly, David, I think it's naive to expect that Kash Patel will do anything except what Donald Trump tells him to do.
Yep.
And I'm sure he's already gotten the order from Trump, cover this up, don't work with the local authorities in Minnesota, and then, this is what's happening. None of this is
Exactly.
surprising to me.
None of this is surprising to me, but I want to put something also into perspective here too. I've been talking to local people about this, and someone's said to me the other or yesterday night on Wednesday night, "Well, can't the state of Minnesota prosecute this person, this ICE agent?" And I said there are three problems here that we face. The first one is that the state of Minnesota, and this would be true in California, the same thing, or any other state. The states can't prosecute federal officials. They're barred from doing that. It's called the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. And so, right off the bat, the state of Minnesota, even if it did its own investigation, even if it reached a conclusion and said this was an unjustified use of force, is basically barred the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution from taking any action. Now, what that means is that what we're supposed to hope for is that the feds are supposed to play the game fair. They're supposed to do the fair investigation, and they have the authority to prosecute if they want, but they're not going to. So we're dealing in a situation here where the federal government is not playing fair in this game, and they're not going to. So that's the first problem, is that getting over this hump. The second problem is the fact that even if somehow you could prosecute this person, he's going to claim, and the Homeland's and Christine Noem's going to say, well, he had partial immunity, limited liability because he was acting under his authority, and he's going to claim that this car was trying to hurt him or kill him, and therefore he had to shoot, even though there's no evidence from any of the tapes that I see that she was threatening his life. And remember, she's driving away. There's no need to shoot. And then even if we do that, you get past that, it's the issue of you're still going to have to convict him of a crime. So the hurdle is enormous. About the only option legally at this point is that the victim's family, could sue the federal government for a civil rights deprivation. But even if they win, it doesn't bring her back. She's been killed. She's been, as you said, executed.
Right. Well, what happened, as far as we can tell, is pretty disgusting because
Right.
these ICE guys jumped out of their pickup. One of them tried to grab the door and scream at the woman, get out, get out. And this other guy, the shooter, came around the front, but he was never actually in front of her car. She was trying to turn to the right
Away
and
from him. Away
away
from him.
from, yes, exactly. So when he fired the first shot, he was standing about, beside the front wheel of her car as it turned away from him. He
Hmm.
fired the first shot through the window at her.
Yeah.
Then he fired the next two through the open driver's side window at
Yeah.
point blank range. He
Yeah.
executed this woman, and as far as I know, her partner was sitting next to her. And then he then strolls down the street all the way down, and he's waving his hands at as though he's the boss,
Yeah.
signaling to the other SUVs, the other guys in their plain clothes and their unmarked vehicles. And this indicates to me there's no clearly no remorse. Bystanders were yelling at him, "Shame, shame, shame." It didn't affect him in the slightest.
Right.
He's the kind of guy that they want. They want
He's,
people to terrorize the American public, and these people are untrained and unrestrained, and we have a major problem on our hand.
yeah. So let me give you a name. Jonathan Ross. That's the shooter. That's the person who shot her. According to the Star Tribune, which is the big local newspaper, he was involved in an incident last year where he was dragged by a car. Don't know all the events, but something sounding similar here. And so here's a person who's got a habit of sort of like sticking his nose in and getting what maybe too close or something like that. And so we don't know. Maybe he's a mean, nasty person. Maybe he's ticked off at the hell that he got dragged last time. But if you watch the video and if you think about it also, first, law enforcement personnel are supposed to be trained in de-escalation. The fact that he goes over, grabs the wheel, I think he apparently even swore at her or something like that. That is not a de-escalation tactic. She pulls away to get away from him. Again, she's driving away. I don't see anything indicating to me at that point that she's a threat to him. Even if we make the strongest argument and say that she had originally tried to hit him, even if we just say for the sake of argument here, even though she didn't, she's driving away. She's not a threat to him at this point. There's no justification from him shooting at this point. But this is going to be interesting to find out in the next couple of days as we get more information about him in terms of his training, about his background and so forth like that. But even beyond it, I think you're making a good point here. The Trump administration, Miller, and all these people are hiring thugs. And let's just call them what they are. They're publicly paid thugs to terrorize people. And here, it's not only bad enough that they're terrorizing persons of color and stopping them randomly like that. She does not look like the profile of anybody that you would have thought was involved in any type of nefarious activity.
Well, it seems to me that there's a possible motive here in him wanting to kill her, and
Yes.
that is because she was, at least as far as I know, she was a legal observer, and a
Yes.
whole bunch have been trained. And I spoke yesterday with a colleague of yours at Minnesota Law School who'd been involved with the training of people like the victim, and they were probably mad at her because they identified as somebody that was monitoring their activities.
Yep.
Is that what happened?
It seems like it. I mean, I've heard two conflicting stories. One that she was monitoring. The other, and again, we don't know all the facts here. The other is that she was truly a bystander. I mean, truly somebody who wasn't involved in either the protests or anything, and was driving through. Again, I don't know where the truth is at this point. That's part of why you do an investigation. But in either case, whether she was a bystander, a monitor, or a protester, in all three cases, does she have a constitutional right to be on the street? Does she have a constitutional right to monitor what ICE is doing? Of course she does. And then also, when the officer basically tries to stop her or grab her wheel or something like that, does she have a right to basically say, without a warrant or whatever like that? I'm putting words in her mouth. You can't stop me. Of course she does. I mean, she's doing what our Bill of Rights told us we have a right to be able to do, and she's she was executed for exercising her rights, whether she was a bystander, a monitor, or a protester. And in none of those cases is it justifiable to do what they did.
Well, they showed their contempt for human life and their cruelty because there was a doctor that arrived on the scene, and he said to the ICE guys, "I'm a doctor, I'm a physician, let me treat her." And they said, "We don't care, go away, no." And then later, when the EMS came, they wouldn't let the EMS people bring in a stretcher to take her body away. And eventually the ICE guys, picked up a body like a sack of potatoes and just dragged her off and threw her into this EMS van.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, essentially, even if we didn't know what they were thinking before, their behavior after the shooting tells us something about their state of mind. If we think about crimes, we always have to look at what people did and then what their state of mind is. We know he shot her. The fact that they wouldn't let the doctor in, they blocked the ambulance, et cetera, like that. That gives us some pretty good indications of their state of mind in terms of what? A reckless disregard for human life, which gets us up to a level of what? First degree murder. I mean, right now I'm looking at it. Somebody who's taught criminal law for many years, and saying that this is hovering somewhere around first degree, premeditated type of murder. I mean, he made a choice to kill her. And I also wonder, given the fact that he was involved in a similar incident like this a few months ago where he got dragged, he may have yet another motive, which is basically, I'm not going to let anybody else drag me, et cetera, like that. So there's a lot going on here.
Well, but there was no threat of her dragging him.
Of course not. Of course not. Of course not.
And he wasn't really in front of the vehicle when he shot the first shot through the windshield, and
Right.
the second two he shot right into her face,
Yes.
through the driver's side open window.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's disgusting. It is absolutely disgusting, and I think that it's a part of what Trump and Miller want. They want the American people to be afraid and be obedient to their fascistic whims, and because this is their private army. These are Trump's brown shirts, and they're going to be deployed in the next election, particularly in these Democratic states like Minnesota and California and Chicago, etc. That's what Trump's all about. That's what he said after the Supreme Court told him that he couldn't send the military in. He said, "I'm going to find another way."
Yeah.
Well, the other way is these ICE goons. And the real thing that is disgusting on top of all of this is that we're paying for these guys, and all the money that's been stolen by Lewandowski and Noam and all of their cronies, and that thug Homan who took 50 grand in a shopping bag and never gave it back. I mean, that's another aspect to the story, which I hope some people in the world of journalism are going to look into.
Yeah, if I look back to it in Trump's big beautiful bill, if I remember correctly, 180 million, not million, 180 billion dollars was appropriated to support ICE type of operations. And we're right, we're basically, again, going back to my phrase, hiring thugs. We're hiring them with huge bonuses, paying them an enormous amount of money, and giving them incredibly limited training in terms of what they're doing. Again, I come back to what I mentioned before, is that good policing is about teaching people how to de-escalate, how not to shoot people. Additionally, people are taught, police not to stand in front of vehicles to avoid things. And so, again, I look at all these different things here, and none of it's good policing, but it's good thuggery. It's good if you want to scare people, intimidate people, and so forth. You just knew something like this was going to happen. And just to put into even more focus here, oh, this is Minneapolis. This took place approximately 2 miles from the place where George Floyd was killed by a police officer, almost 6 years ago. And so this is a city that's on edge still from that, and I can tell you now, that as we're recording this on Thursday, the city is incredibly on edge. People are nervous, they're scared. The Minneapolis public school system closed schools for today, Thursday and Friday, simply because of a lot of the trauma and a lot of the fear that's out there right now. So Trump's getting exactly what he wants, which is to scare people into submission.
Well, David Schultz, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thank you. Unfortunately, under these circumstances.
And again, I've been speaking with David Schultz, who's a professor of political science at Hamline University and the University of Minnesota School of Law. He's the author of 30 books and various articles on American politics, ethics, election law, and media. And he is the author of American Politics in the Age of Ignorance, Why Lawmakers Choose Belief Over Research. And his latest book is Generational Politics in the United States, From the Silence to Gen Z and Beyond. We're going to take a beach station break, back looking into whether Venezuelan leadership still in power sacrificed Maduro and his Cuban protectors in a secret deal with Trump and Rubio. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Alejandro Velasco, who's an Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and a professor at New York University, an historian of modern Latin America, focusing on social movements, urban culture, and democratization. He's the author of Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. And he has an article at The Guardian, Maduro is gone, but his regime is intact. What happened behind the scenes? Welcome to Background Briefing, Alejandro Velasco.
Thanks, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you raised the intriguing question, which I think a lot of people are starting to focus on. The fact that the Venezuelan leadership is still in power, and that the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, and along with her brother who runs the legislature, are very much in power. It sort of smells a little bit as if they sacrificed Maduro and his Cuban protectors in a secret deal with Trump and Rubio. So how far can we dig into this possibility?
I mean, of course, it's speculative, but this is one of those moments where the speculation is pretty profound. I think there are a few clues that we have to the possibility, or perhaps even likelihood, that there may have been some back channel collusion, or at least conversations that may have had Maduro as linchpin. And one of those is the speed and seeming seamlessness, and of course we've seen it just over the last few days, of a post-Maduro transition in Venezuela. Obviously early on Saturday, we heard some chest-beating claims about anti-imperialism. But by Sunday, all the pieces seem to be in place, including not just, as you said, Jorge Rodriguez, Delcy's brother, but also, extremely importantly, the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, and then Diosdado Cabello, who's the interior minister and therefore controls the police, security forces, intelligence agencies, and also the paramilitary groups. All of them very quickly falling into line. And then by Monday, a new National Assembly had been sworn in, including some opposition politicians. And already, of course, at least domestically, today, the big news is that, political prisoners are being released. So, if you think about all these things in conjunction, and you put that together with what we knew from reporting prior to, the attack on Venezuela on Saturday, which was that Maduro had been negotiating with the Trump administration, but the sticking point seemed to be Maduro himself. He was the one who seemed not to, not to be ceding on the possibility of staying in power or, fleeing to, some kind of golden exile, etc. And so at some point, this is again where speculation comes into place. If they were already, by they meaning the upper echelons of the Chavista, Madurista government, if they were already willing to go as far as we seem to think that they were willing to go, but Maduro was the only sticking point. At what point did it become more riskier for them to continue to be in this stare down with the United States than just give up Maduro and have some kind of assurances that they would remain in power? And so, I think that's part of what we can assess as perhaps a reason behind this back channel potential deal.
Well, the negotiations with Maduro go back to Richard Grenell last year, and apparently they were fairly extensive. And the one sticking point, as you point out, was that Maduro would not go off into exile. And then Trump called him a number of times and apparently had similar conversations, and Maduro was obstinate about that one point. And I think from what we're learning is that Trump finally gave up because he felt that Maduro dancing on camera was sort of imitating Trump dancing at his rallies, and that really annoyed Trump. I don't know. I mean, you have to sort of laugh at the absurdity of it, but we have an absurd president who's a child. Remember, he was mad at the opposition leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and the White House have leaked the notion that had Machado given up a Nobel Prize for Donald Trump, she'd be in power today. Not that that's an easy thing to pull off, but you know what I mean. I mean, the CIA apparently told Trump that she doesn't have any traction in the country, which seems hard to believe. So that's what we sort of know, don't we, so far?
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is something that I mentioned in my piece. It's not so much that she doesn't have traction in the country. There's another good op-ed today in the Times by my colleague Francisco Rodriguez, who specifically is thinking about why Maria Corina Machado may have gone out of favor. It's that she lacked the standing and power necessary with the people who matter in a transition, which are those who hold the levers of government and the institutions, and especially the security forces, right? Like which would have raised the stakes exponentially for the United States of any kind of transition. And that would have been a transition where you would have to imagine if the either medium or long-term goals of the United States were to secure more of Venezuela's oil wealth, would not have been made possible without significant presence of U.S. ground troops. And at that point, the calculus for intervention shifts completely. And I do think that that's something that perhaps the major thing that the current government in Venezuela is calculating that they have as not necessarily leverage, but more room to maneuver than might otherwise seem to be the case with this threat of an armada, right off the shores of Venezuela, which is that, at least for now, even of course, though he has said that he's not afraid of committing ground troops, the costs, the political costs of that for, as you well said, Trump's inflated sense of self and his ego and the rest of it would be too much to bear. And so they must know that, there's so much that they're willing to do to placate, Trump and Rubio and them, but there's also limits to what the United States might do in terms of the leverage that it holds.
And that leverage is not going to last forever. The cost of keeping that fleet off the coast for months and even years is ridiculous and insurmountable. But let's talk about the obstacles, if you will. I mean, I talked the other day to Professor Pape at University of Chicago, an expert on guerrilla war and insurgency and terrorism, and he made the point that Delcy Rodriguez, in spite of her friendly phone conversations with Marco Rubio, is caught between a rock and a hard place. Either if she doesn't play ball with Trump, they'll B-2 bomb or drop a bomb on her, or if she does play ball with Donald Trump, Cabello, and perhaps Vladimir Padrino Lopez, but certainly Cabello, might eliminate her. So let's talk about Cabello, who is the Interior Minister. He's a very brutal guy. He's responsible, from what human rights groups have suggested, for up to more than 20,000 extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, torture, the jailing of thousands of political prisoners. And they were released today, but largely by Jorge Rodriguez, Delcy's brother. So he's in charge of the colectivos, and he's been running around with them, posing with them on social media, chanting and clenching their fists behind him, saying, always loyal, never traitors, and to doubt is to betray. And Cabello has that same slogan emblazoned on his cap, to doubt is to betray. So he's a pretty hardcore guy, is he not? And I can't see him moving.
Yeah, I mean, his hardcoreness, to put it one way, goes way back. We have to remember that he was one of the original co-conspirators of Hugo Chavez's failed 1992 coup. He landed in prison after that unsuccessful coup, but he was part of the original, Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario 200 that Hugo Chavez and others like Cabello began, over in the 1980s. So he is a true believer for sure. That there's no doubt about that. But the same, call it, CV of tyranny that you just described is also, of course, the major liability that Cabello has to, in some ways, to be held in check. Diosdado Cabello right now would be the most direct target of any kind of transition towards democratic government, precisely because of his, especially human rights violations record. Even more so than far more so than Padrino Lopez, whose primary crimes have to do with corruption, and certainly much more so than Jorge Rodriguez or even Delcy Rodriguez. So he has a tremendous stake in remaining in some degree in power. And so, yes, it's true that if he becomes the next kind of, boogeyman of the United States, then he might be in a position where, in order to save his skin, he has to try to, as you well suggested, take out Delcy if she's showing herself too compliant. On the other hand, again, his primary interest is to remain in the sphere of power. So I think Delcy has, as your other guest suggested, has a really difficult line to thread here, but it's not an impossible one if she plays her cards right.
But isn't there a history of rivalry between Delcy and her brother Jorge with Cabello?
Yes, certainly after Hugo Chavez's death, and as Maduro tried to consolidate his own position after becoming president in 2013. In part having to do precisely with the two very different spheres of influence that each control, right? So as you noted, Cabello's primary sphere of influence is with security forces, police, National Guard, and very importantly, the colectivos, these paramilitary groups throughout the country, which could absolutely play a very spoiler type role in any kind of transition context. And so in that sense, he has significant leverage over the Rodriguez siblings. And what Delcy and Jorge Rodriguez bring to the table, which is of interest significantly to Diosdado, is Delcy has been former president of the PDVSA, knows the major players, has been
that's the national oil company.
Yeah, PDVSA as a national oil company, knows the major players, has, directly been in negotiations with Chevron, which is the only, U.S. oil company that has remained in Venezuela throughout all this time, and therefore is in a position to be able to negotiate with other oil companies coming in. And Jorge, of course, not only controls the National Assembly, but also in powerful ways the courts, all of which are significant. So weirdly, what we see here is that, the one figure that didn't have a kind of own constituency of power was Nicolás Maduro. His primary constituency, so to speak, were these other players who now, in a strange way are kind of, balancing and checking each other's power in a very uncertain moment of transition. And I do think that for the moment, at least, they see the need for each other if the primary goal, which is to remain in some kind of power, is met. And there's no greater indication of that, at least for now and today, than, well, two. One, that we've seen a little, but not in the kind of numbers that we would have imagined. Colectivos like roaming around all parts of Venezuela, over the past few days. But the other one just came out today, over the last couple of hours, which is the release of political prisoners. And that must have been a very significant concession from Diosdado Cabello at this moment of transition for Delcy and Jorge.
So nobody ever said that Maduro was the brightest bulb, whereas Delcy Rodriguez is apparently pretty sharp. And I'm just wondering about how much she's willing to cooperate with the Americans, which she appears to do in private, but then in public she denounces them. I mean, after all, her father was killed by the prior regime before Chavez came into power, and there was even some suggestion that the CIA had fingerprints on him being tortured and killed. So she may have some bitterness towards the United States.
Yes, for sure. But she would be even more bitter, if she were behind bars in Brooklyn.
That's
Um,
true.
so, I think that all this has to be measured against, what are landscapes of realpolitik and, actual choices and opportunities and constraints, among different players. I do think, and this is now really significant conjecture, but that Delcy does stand potentially to gain, insofar as if she, again, very difficult, I'm not suggesting that this is in any way sort of easy, but if she's able to navigate, the internal rifts and power players in her coalition right now, and also to, negotiate with the United States, what she might be able to see is, in fact, some significant improvement in, say, for instance, Venezuela's economy that could translate potentially into political capital of her own in the potential scenario of a somewhat far away, but not too far away, presidential elections, right? And so, she does have the capacity, she does have the possibility of being, now that Maduro's gone, and in some ways he sort of has concentrated all the toxicity, certainly from the Trump administration, but even among many in the opposition, certainly, domestically, if not necessarily expatriate, to then generate a political base of her own and position herself as, the person who, navigated Venezuela out of this moment of, tremendous uncertainty into some kind of recovery while maintaining actually some degree of independence. And then that would be, her political calling card going forward. Obviously, I can't imagine the metaphor that would be required for this tremendous act of political dexterity. But as you well said, she does have the political chops to potentially pull it off.
Well, it seems to be happening, though, just in closing, Alejandro, because the idea of Trump being able to cash in some oil, give it back to her to make life better for the Venezuelan people and to ease the path for her in the election. That it all makes sense. So I thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ian. I appreciate it.
And again, I'll be speaking with Alejandro Velasco, who's Associate Dean for faculty and academic affairs and professor at New York University, an historian of modern Latin America focusing on social movements, urban culture, and democratization. He's the author of Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. And he has an article at The Guardian, Maduro is gone, but his regime is intact. What happened behind the scenes? We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with Ryan Cooper, who spent time in Greenland last summer and joins us to try to make sense of Trump's belligerent bluster.
América está gritando y el siglo se vuelve azul, pampa, ríos y montañas liberan su propia luz. La copla no quiere dueños, patrones no más mandar. La guitarra americana peleando aprendió a cantar, peleando aprendió a cantar, peleando aprendió a cantar.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Ryan Cooper, a senior editor at The American Prospect. He is the co-host of the Left Anchor podcast, as well as the author of How Are You Going to Pay for That? Smart Answers to the Dumbest Questions in Politics. And his latest articles at The American Prospect are Trump's Cargo Cult Imperialism in Venezuela and Donald Trump's Degenerate Plans for Greenland. Welcome to Background Briefing, Ryan Cooper.
Glad to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ryan. And last summer you spent time in Greenland, and obviously I and our listeners would love to find out, get some clarity on what's behind Trump's belligerent bluster, because it just doesn't make any sense what he's doing, except perhaps what he's achieving at the moment, both with the distraction of Venezuela and of Greenland, is that the Epstein files have not been released. Only 1% of them have been released in spite of a law passed by the House and Senate and signed by Trump, demanding them be handed over weeks ago. So is that what's going on here?
I think that could be in their, list of motivations. Certainly, Trump has always really disliked it whenever the television is talking about anything other than him being a very good boy and worthy of the Nobel Prize. But with regards to Greenland, he was talking about that long before, when he first took office. I kind of forgot about it for a while. And I think that, you just see this sort of brutish, adventure conqueror, a sort of tin pot dictator, 30 years into a career of progressive senility and, brain damage from being surrounded by sycophants and yes men all the time. And also the fact that the likely fact that is that Trump is probably looking at a Mercator projection map, which exaggerates the size of Greenland by like a factor of 10. And, it's just, he just sees it and he just thinks, oh, I'll have that, I mean, it's unlike, even Hitler thought he had to make up some excuse about how Germans were being oppressed in the Sudetenland before he stole that piece of country. But there's not even that type of excuse to just like take, a big piece. I think he regards it as his own personal property. That he can, make into a part of his, fiefdom of areas that he controls and exploits for his own personal benefit and nobody else's.
Well, the argument he puts forth, which is this sort of national security argument, that we need it for our national security, that somehow Russia and China are getting their hooks into the place that's administered by Denmark, which is a NATO country. That doesn't make any sense, Ryan, because there used to be about 20 U.S. bases during the Cold War in Greenland, and now they're just down to one. Yeah. So it's not as if the U.S. has been concerned about Greenland since 1990.
Yeah, I mean, even today, as I say in the piece, American security, it's our security posture has taken entirely for granted good relations with Greenland and Denmark and access to Greenland's airspace and land by the U.S. military. We have that base, as you said. That's one thing I was somewhat surprised to learn when I was traveling in Greenland was that most people seemingly were welcoming of more military investment in the country. That like the idea that you come in and like improve the base, maybe build some other, facilities. I mean, that's jobs, It's just why Americans would welcome a military base, in their own backyard, a lot of them. It's something to do, so a paycheck. And the result of that long-standing relationship, going back to during the Second World War, is that, you have all of these installations. And above all, as I mentioned in the piece, there's this critical nuclear missile warning radar installations. There's one in Alaska, there's one in Greenland, there's one in Britain, there's one in California.
And
And
Canada, yeah.
and well, there's a whole network of different systems, the NWS, Northern Warning System. But yeah, there's just an absolutely core, strategic asset right there, Site J, which, is this massive, radar installation. And it's, mostly undefended on the ground. It's not in any type of fortress because American defense planners always assumed Greenland's our friend, NATO's our friend. It's part of our whole approach. And it's, just being thrown away. That we are making potentially NATO and Greenland and Denmark into an enemy and the damage they could inflict just by blowing up that one mostly undefended radar installation is incalculable. It would just completely throw our entire deterrence architecture into chaos. And just because of the, degenerate whims of this one aging would-be dictator who doesn't understand anything about anything other than I'll have that.
Well, the Danish special forces are there, right? And there's no Chinese and Russians boots on the ground, are there? I mean, when you were there, you didn't see any Chinese or Russians, I imagine.
I mean, not that I could identify, apparently while I was there were also some MAGA chud type of people who were doing influence operations there, trying to like, raise, split off Greenland from Denmark, make people much like Russia did in 2016 in the American election, trying to raise animus between Greenlanders and Denmark. But no, this is something that would not even have occurred to anybody in Greenland until Trump took office. And now, people might be thinking otherwise because, if America is that untrustworthy, who can you trust?
Right, but there's been some friction between the Danish government and the Greenlanders, who some of
Oh
whom
yeah.
feel they're being treated like colonial subjects. So what's the friction there, and is the US going to try and exploit that? Or I imagine it already is, given those MAGA people that showed up last summer.
Yes, so Greenland is a former colony, and I would say it's not a colony anymore because they do have representation in the Danish parliament, so it's not it's like formally, in a sort of like political institution sense, it is part of Denmark. It's also semi-independent. Um, and there is a bad blood, to some degree. There's some terrible things that the Danish government did over the years. It was exploited as a colony hundreds of years ago. There's a big scandal that came out a couple of years ago about how Danish doctors in the 1950s and 1960s were putting IUDs, sometimes without the consent or knowledge, into young Greenlandic, women and girls. A similar story that you hear on like Native American reservations in this country. But, the Danes, to their credit, have kind of made restitution for that. And the way that they set up the architecture means that Greenland gets a massive ongoing subsidy from the Danish government. It's like half the government budget. And while there's a strong contingent of people who would prefer to be independent, they would like Greenland to be an independent country. The overwhelming sentiment is that, well, that could happen maybe in the future, but they would have to gradually and carefully wean themselves off of that Danish subsidy because it would cause a crisis if it was just removed all at once. And above all, nobody, absolutely nobody wants to be part of the United States. I mean, this is you think that you're going to get $10,000 a year in subsidy from the American state? Are you crazy? Like that's not going to happen. You're going to be roped into, the most poorly run rich country in the world, and if there's a choice between, having to be associated with Denmark versus the US, it's perfectly obvious to basically everyone, the handful of, kind of loopy exceptions, which one would be better.
Right, but you're only talking about, what, 85,000 people? And
No,
my...
not even that. Like 56,000.
Is it really? Oh, well, then that's easy to subvert, and obviously, not that it'd be successful, but, the US did send a CIA team into Venezuela last summer, and you've seen the results of that. So I would not be surprised if Trump has ordered the CIA into Greenland already.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you could certainly take it. They have no military to speak of. The themselves, the Danes have a few ships there, but the Danish military is nothing to, stand up against the US Navy, of course. Um, but I don't think there's really any chance of the sort of an influence operation working in that way, because above all, it was something that you'd have to keep quiet. You'd have to focus on. Um, raising divisions between Greenlanders, legitimate grievances, and then you have some Danish people. They resent the amount of subsidy that they get. And there's not that many of them, but that is a current. But what Trump has done is totally the opposite by making these, just insane belligerent demands. He has unified Greenlanders against the outside enemy and helped bring them closer to Denmark. Because there's an election in 2025. And, the more moderate, centrist types who favor continued association with um, Denmark did way better than they probably would have done without Trump, making all this noise. That people had a defensive reaction. It was a similar thing that happened in Australia. He's just discredited his own cause by being so loud and obnoxious about everything that, you can't. He's overwhelmingly dominating the information space, and that's all anyone pays attention to.
So just talk a little bit about the impracticality of extracting minerals, even if they're there. The rare earths are supposed to be the lure that Trump is attracted to. At least that's what he says. I mean, you got thousands of feet of ice, don't you? I mean, and there's no roads, there's no communications. It would cost a fortune to extract minerals, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. This was something I was somewhat surprised to learn, but I talked to a lot of business folks and folks, around the government, and they said, yeah, there's a lot of this stuff that people have found, but, outside of a handful of spots, it's really not that economically practical to exploit. There's like a gold mine that's been opened and closed and opened and closed, and I think opened again most recently. And they're trying to, make some of it happen, but it's a real uphill battle. I mean, the thing about those rare earths is that they're not rare. They're all over the place. The United States has huge deposits of that stuff. And so, you know, the idea that you could just run in and just, grab up huge quantities of valuable minerals lying on the ground, it's ridiculous. You're talking about, in most of this giant, largely, trackless wilderness, coming in and you got to build a port and roads and power facilities and housing and the place has no infrastructure whatsoever. Doesn't, as you said, it doesn't even have roads between the major settlements. But you got to take a ferry or a plane. And so, it's just not economical. People would be much better advised to go to a place that's closer to global shipping routes. It's not choked with ice half the year and be much easier to develop and make a lot more money. And that is, what's already happening right now.
Well, of course, the irony is, Ryan, that the US had the lead in processing rare earths and making these valuable magnets for aerospace and other technologies. And the leading company that founded this processing method was in Indianapolis. It was owned by Archibald Cox, the Watergate guy's son, and he sold it to the Chinese. And that's why the Chinese have an advantage in rare earths. It's not, as you point out, the stuff is everywhere, but processing it is really the key, and we gave away that technology.
Absolutely. No, and I mean, this is something that would have taken a lot of attention and policy, incentives, going back 20 years. Because the secret sauce of the Chinese is not caring about horrible environmental devastation. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. You could have set up facilities that were, they cleaned them up and so on, and subsidies commensurate to make that happen, to preserve that, vital infrastructure so that we could have a supply of, finished rare earth metals as outside of the control of, the Chinese. But we weren't minding the store, and it's just, totally typical of Trump to be focusing on, a not even economical supply of stuff that we already have, rather than paying attention to the complex institutional details of how to get the stuff that we actually want.
Right. So, Ryan, just in the last couple of minutes, back to the notion that this is just a fact, that the Department of Justice is not releasing the Epstein files. They've only released 1%, mostly useless stuff that has already been in the public domain. So it's just clear that they're, Trump, I'm sure, has told Bondi to hold up, just sit on it, because he doesn't want, as he said was he screaming to Marjorie Taylor Greene over the phone, that I don't want to hurt my friends by releasing this stuff. So that's what this is all about. And I'm just wondering, are the American public buying into this nonsense about Greenland? Because this reality TV guy who keeps distracting us with a tawdry episode every other day.
I don't think so. I believe I saw a poll a while ago about how many people would support like an actual violent conquest of Greenland, and it's like 6%. I mean, this is something that wouldn't even occur to even most Republicans, I don't think, because as we've been talking about, it straight up makes no sense. What are we going to do with it that we couldn't already do? It's crazy. If you want to go visit, you can go. I did it. I went there. They've set up recently new flights, new airports to go visit different parts of it. They want your business, or at least they did. They might not anymore. And so, insofar as this happens, I don't think it will be popular. And I think I guess I just hope that over time, the Epstein files will continue to be a sort of slow burn scandal, and people keep bringing it up, keep filing lawsuits. Insofar as this is a distraction strategy, that it's not going to work over the long term.
Well, Ryan Cooper, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Ryan Cooper, who's a senior editor at the American Prospect. He's the co-host of the Left Anchor podcast, as well as the author of How Are You Going to Pay for That? Smart Answers to the Dumbest Questions in Politics. And his latest articles at the American Prospect are Trump's Cargo Cult Imperialism in Venezuela and Donald Trump's Degenerate Plans for Greenland. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.com backgroundbriefing.org/donate and or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.